How do you engineer silence in the loudest city on earth? In a world of basalt roads and constant commercial traffic, Roman residents had to turn their homes into fortresses of sound isolation. From massive, tough masonry to strategic interior layouts, we are recreating the ancient tech that kept the urban roar at bay. Welcome back, traveler, to Boring History, a quiet corner of the world where we leave behind the noise of today and gently wander into the stillness of the past. Here, the fires of history burn low and steady, casting long shadows over forgotten stories. We are not here for kings and conquests, but for the quiet, strange, and sometimes unsettling moments that time nearly buried. Before you get comfy, go ahead and like the video and subscribe, only if you're actually enjoying it. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I'm always curious to see the mix of places and time zones hanging out here together. Chapter 1: The City That Never Slept. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine you are standing at the edge of the ancient world's greatest city. The year is somewhere around 100 AD, during the reign of the Emperor Trajan, at the very height of Rome's power and population. The sun has not yet fully risen above the hills, but already the city is screaming, not in fear, not in pain, simply in existence. The sound hits you before anything else. It is layered, dense, and relentless in a way that has no single source and no single solution. Iron-rimmed wheels grind and shriek against stone-paved streets. Mules bray and stamp. Vendors shout their morning wares in overlapping waves. Bread here, fish there, oil, wine, cloth. Their voices trained to cut through the din the way a blade cuts through water. Somewhere above you, from a window several stories up, in one of the towering insulae, those great apartment blocks that housed the majority of Rome's population, a man is already arguing with his wife, or perhaps his landlord. It is impossible to tell. Their voices ricochet off the narrow canyon walls of the alley below and arrive at your ears as pure, undifferentiated fury. This was Rome, not the marble Rome of emperors and monuments that we reconstruct in museums and cinema. The living Rome. The Rome of approximately 1 million human beings packed into an area of roughly 13 square kilometers, breathing the same air, drawing water from the same aqueducts, and producing, together, a noise that no previous civilization in the history of the world had ever generated at such scale or such concentration. To understand why Rome developed what we might cautiously call noise management policies, we must first understand why Rome was so extraordinarily, almost pathologically loud. The answer lies in a combination of geography, demography, urban design, or rather, the frequent absence of it, economics, and the sheer unstoppable energy of a city at the center of the known world. Rome had grown without a plan. Unlike Alexandria, which was laid out in a grid by its Greek founders with deliberate civic intention, or the later Roman colonies that were planted across the empire with military precision, Rome itself had accumulated organically over centuries. Streets followed ancient cattle tracks and the paths of long-forgotten streams. Neighborhoods pressed against one another without buffer or breathing room. The famous 7 hills, the Palatine, Aventine, Capitoline, Quirinal, Viminal, Esquiline, and Celian, created a topography that funneled sound into valleys and narrow passes, amplifying it in the way a seashell amplifies the sea. The insula were at the heart of the acoustic crisis. These apartment buildings, the dominant form of housing for Rome's vast working and poor population, rose to extraordinary heights for the ancient world, sometimes 5, 6, or even 7 stories, in flagrant defiance of laws that tried repeatedly and largely unsuccessfully to limit their height. They were built quickly, often cheaply, from a combination of concrete, brick, and timber, and they shared walls with their neighbors on every side. There was no insulation in the modern sense. Sound traveled through these buildings the way water travels through rock, finding every crack, every gap, every thin partition between one family's cramped apartment and another's. In a typical Roman insula, you might have a ground floor occupied by shops tabernae, whose owners lived and worked in the same space, often conducting business that involved hammering, grinding, boiling, or shouting from before dawn until well after dark. Above them, on the intermediate floors, lived merchants, craftspeople, and skilled workers of moderate means. And above them, in the cheapest and most dangerous apartments near the top, where fire was a constant threat and water had to be carried up by hand, lived the urban poor, freedmen, migrants, seasonal workers, the vast anonymous multitude that kept the city functioning, and who had, in terms of acoustic relief, essentially nowhere to go. The streets themselves were narrow by almost any standard. Decado and Decumanus, the two main axes of a properly planned Roman town, might be wide and dignified, but in the organic tangle of Rome's older neighborhoods, streets could be as narrow as 3 meters, barely wide enough for 2 people to pass comfortably, let alone for the constant flow of commerce and human traffic that Rome required to feed and supply itself. And feed itself it did, voraciously. Rome imported grain from Egypt and North Africa, wine from Spain and Gaul, oil from throughout the Mediterranean, luxury goods from as far as India and China. All of this had to arrive somewhere, be processed somewhere, and be distributed somehow. The port city of Ostia handled the sea traffic, but the final distribution within Rome itself was handled by an army of carts, wagons, porters, and middlemen whose collective activities generated a constant low roar of commercial activity. We know about the sounds of Rome, not from acoustic measurements. Such things did not exist in the ancient world, but from literature. And the literature is remarkably consistent in its testimony. Roman writers across several centuries return again and again to the noise of the city, with a mixture of vivid description and barely concealed outrage. The satirist Juvenal, writing in the early 2nd century AD, produced perhaps the most famous noise complaint in the ancient world, lamenting that the sick and the sleepless in Rome were tortured by the thunderous passage of wagons through streets too narrow to absorb their passage, the shouting of drovers, and the general pandemonium of urban life. Juvenal's solution, characteristically cynical, was simply to leave, to abandon the city entirely for the relative peace of a provincial town, where one might actually sleep. The poet Martial, a near contemporary of Juvenal, and a man of considerably less means, could not so easily escape. He catalogued the sounds of his daily existence in his apartment with the precision of a man who had been driven to the edge of his tolerance. The schoolteacher, who began his lessons before dawn, bellowing at his students in the street below, the money changers rattling their coins, the gold beaters hammering at their work, the traveling entertainers with their drums, the night watchmen on their rounds. Martial's poems are not merely complaints, they are detailed acoustic maps of a city that had no off switch. And yet, and this is the crucial point that distinguishes Rome from many earlier civilizations, the Romans did not simply accept this situation as an immutable feature of existence. They debated it, they wrote about it, they legislated about it, they built around it, they retreated from it when they could afford to, and philosophized about enduring it when they could not. Rome was the first civilization in the Western world to treat noise not merely as an unpleasant fact of life, but as a civic problem requiring civic responses. The story of how Rome managed, or tried to manage, or spectacularly failed to manage, its noise is not a story of triumph. Rome never solved its noise problem. Its streets were never silent, its nights were never truly quiet, and its poorest citizens went to their graves, having slept badly for most of their lives. But it is a story of remarkable sophistication, of a society grappling seriously and creatively with one of the most persistent and democratic miseries of urban existence. It is, in the truest sense, a very human story. And so we begin. The city of Rome, at the height of its power, was a place of extraordinary beauty and extraordinary suffering, of imperial grandeur and grinding daily discomfort. Its marble temples gleamed above its chaotic streets. Its aqueducts delivered clean water to its fountains, while its alleys rang with the sounds of 1,000,000 human lives pressing against one another in the darkness before dawn. It was magnificent. It was brutal. It was above all, impossibly, magnificently, exhaustingly loud. And someone, eventually, was going to have to do something about it. Chapter 2. The Voices of Complaint. What Romans actually said. Before there were noise ordinances, before there were architects designing acoustic refuges, before there were philosophers theorizing about the nature of distraction, there were simply people complaining. And the Romans, it must be said, were extraordinary complainers, not in the petty, small-spirited way of those who merely grumble, but in the grand literary tradition of people who transform their suffering into art, who take the raw material of daily misery and forge it, in the heat of their irritation, into something worth reading 2,000 years later. The voices of Rome's noise complaints have survived because they were written down by people who were very good at writing, and who were very, very annoyed. Let us begin with Lucius Annaeus Seneca, because Seneca is our most detailed and most philosophically interesting witness to the Roman noise experience. Seneca was a Stoic philosopher, the tutor and later the advisor of the Emperor Nero, one of the most powerful and wealthy men in the Roman world. He could, at various points in his career, have lived anywhere. He chose, for a period that he describes in his famous letters to Lucilius, to live above a public bathhouse, a thermae, and the letters he wrote during this period constitute perhaps the most vivid piece of acoustic writing to survive from the ancient world. We will return to Seneca and his bathhouse in detail in a later chapter, because his account deserves its own space. But here, in the context of understanding what Romans actually experienced and felt about noise, it is worth noting the particular quality of Seneca's complaint. He does not simply say it is loud. He itemizes, he catalogues, he separates the sounds of the bathhouse below him, the way a naturalist separates species, the grunts of the weightlifters, the slapping of hands against skin in massage, the shrill cries of the hair pluckers, the splash of those jumping into the pool, the voices of the food sellers, the perfume merchants, the sausage man. Each sound is named, placed, characterized. Seneca hears everything and forgets nothing, and then, remarkably, he concludes that the noise does not bother him, that a properly disciplined mind can exist in perfect equanimity above a bathhouse. This is either a profound philosophical achievement or a very sophisticated form of denial, and the reader is left to decide which. Juvenal is far less serene. Decimus Junius Juvenalis, writing his satires somewhere in the late 1st and early 2nd century AD, was a man of bitter wit and sharp social observation, and the third of his 16 satires, known simply as Satire 3, contains what is justly famous as the greatest noise complaint of the ancient world. Juvenal puts his words in the mouth of a character named Umbricius, who is leaving Rome forever and explaining to a friend exactly why. The city is impossible, Umbricius says. It is corrupt, overcrowded, dominated by foreign influences, and it is deafeningly, sleeplessly, maddeningly loud. The passage on noise in Satire 3 is worth dwelling on for what it reveals about the specific sounds that tormented the Roman night. Umbricius describes the wagons that thunder through the narrow streets while the wealthy sleep, the great supply carts that Caesar's famous edict had pushed out of daylight hours into darkness, so that the deliveries Rome required kept rolling through the night, their iron wheels striking the stone paving with a violence that could, Juvenal writes, rouse a sleeping sea calf. He describes the noise as something physically aggressive, not merely unpleasant but actively injurious. The man who could sleep through the Roman night, he suggests, must be gifted with superhuman powers of oblivion. Juvenal also gives us a precious detail that speaks to the social stratification of noise suffering in Rome. He notes that the wealthy, those who could afford houses on the hills, or who could travel through the city on the shoulders of slaves in curtained litters, were somewhat buffered from the worst of urban cacophony. It was the poor, the renters of upper-floor apartments, the people who actually had to walk through Rome's streets, who suffered most from noise. This observation cuts to something important. Noise pollution in ancient Rome, as in our own cities today, was not an equal opportunity affliction. It fell hardest on those with the fewest resources to escape it. Marcus Valerius, Martialis Martial, as we call him, was in many ways Juvenal's opposite in temperament, even as he catalogued the same urban miseries. Where Juvenal is volcanic, Martial is sardonic. Where Juvenal rages, Martial shrugs with elaborate performed weariness. His 12 books of epigrams are studied with references to the noise of Roman daily life, each one a small, perfectly cut gem of irritation. Martial lived, for much of his life in Rome, in a fairly modest apartment. He was never wealthy. Despite his fame, and the epigrams he wrote about his neighbors, read like dispatches from a man slowly being driven mad by proximity. There is the schoolmaster who positions himself in the street below and teaches by shouting, beginning before the birds. There is the coppersmith next door whose hammering never stops. There is the baker who fires up his ovens before dawn. The fullers, the laundry workers who stamp and sing through the night. The beggars and entertainers who ring the tenement from morning to night with their incessant demands for attention and coin. What is striking about Martial's catalogue is not its misery, but its specificity. He is not complaining about noise in the abstract. He is complaining about particular sounds made by particular categories of people at particular times. This specificity matters because it tells us something important. The Romans had a sophisticated taxonomy of noise. They could distinguish between sounds that were merely unpleasant and sounds that were genuinely intolerable. They had a sense that some noise was the necessary accompaniment of productive urban life, the forge, the bakery, the school, while other noise was gratuitous, excessive, or poorly timed. This distinction between necessary and unnecessary noise lies at the heart of every noise management strategy Rome would develop. Gaius Plinius, Caecilius Secundus, Pliny the Younger, to distinguish him from his encyclopedist uncle, gives us a different perspective, partly because he was considerably wealthier than Martial and therefore had more options. Pliny's letters, a carefully curated collection of correspondence published during his lifetime, are an invaluable source for understanding upper-class Roman attitudes toward noise because they capture both the experience of urban noise and the deliberate strategies Pliny used to escape it. In one of his most famous letters, Pliny describes his practice of sleeping in a room specially designed to face away from the street and the household activity, essentially creating for himself, within his own house, a private acoustic refuge. He describes his study at his Laurentine villa, the country retreat he used to escape the city, with evident satisfaction as a place of perfect quiet, cut off from the sounds of the sea, the wind, and any human activity. Pliny was a man who thought carefully about where he positioned himself in space in relation to noise, and who designed his environments, or had them designed with acoustic peace as an explicit goal. Marcus Tullius Cicero, writing a century and a half before Pliny and occupying a somewhat different political world, is nonetheless equally vivid on the subject of urban noise when it surfaces in his extensive correspondence. Cicero, who was frequently forced to be in Rome for political reasons he found distasteful, wrote to friends of the relief he felt on returning to his country properties. His letters from Tusculum, his estate in the hills above Rome, have a quality of almost physical relaxation, a man breathing out after holding his breath for too long. The contrast with his letters from Rome is telling. Rome means noise, crowd, obligation, strain. The country means quiet, thought, reading, conversation with friends. But perhaps the most socially revealing voice in this chorus of complaint does not belong to a famous writer at all. It belongs to the anonymous world of Roman graffiti, cursed tablets, and legal papyri, where ordinary Romans, people who would never write a satire or a philosophical letter, left their own record of noise, grievance. Archaeological discoveries in Pompeii, Herculaneum, and across the Roman world have uncovered evidence of neighbors cursing one another over noise disputes, of legal complaints about loud workshops adjacent to residential properties, of citizens appealing to local officials for relief from the incessant hammering of a metal worker or the nightly cacophony of a tavern. These anonymous voices matter enormously because they establish that noise consciousness in Rome was not merely an elite literary preoccupation. It was a genuinely popular concern, felt across social classes, articulated in whatever medium was available: formal literature for the educated wealthy, graffiti and legal petitions for everyone else. Taken together, the voices of Rome's noise complaint paint an extraordinarily vivid picture of a city that was louder than almost anything we can easily imagine today, not because our modern cities are quiet. They are not, but because Rome lacked the one thing we take for granted in our relationship with urban noise: the ability to simply turn things off. There was no mechanical noise, in the modern sense. In Rome, every sound was made by a living being, human or animal, whose activities could in principle be controlled, regulated, or relocated. And yet, the sheer density of those living beings, packed into the smallest possible urban space, created a cumulative acoustic environment that felt, to those who lived within it, overwhelming, relentless, and inescapable. Rome complained. Rome always complained. And eventually, Rome acted. Chapter 3. Julius Caesar's revolutionary decree. In the year 44 BC, the Roman world stood at one of its great hinge moments. Julius Caesar, conqueror of Gaul, victor of the civil wars, dictator perpetuo, dictator in perpetuity of Rome, was reshaping the city and the state with the same focused energy that had reshaped the map of the known world. He was planning a new forum, rebuilding temples, extending the city's infrastructure, reforming the calendar. He was also, in one of the most surprisingly modern acts of his astonishing career, attempting to regulate the noise of his capital city. The measure is recorded in the Lex Iulia Municipalis, a wide-ranging piece of Caesarian legislation dealing with the administration of Rome and Italian municipalities, and its noise provision is deceptively simple in its statement and revolutionary in its implication. With some exceptions, wheeled vehicles were forbidden from operating within the city of Rome during daylight hours. from approximately sunrise to 2 hours before sunset. Read that slowly, because it deserves to be appreciated. Julius Caesar, the same man who crossed the Rubicon, who conquered Britain, who seduced the Queen of Egypt, sat down and thought carefully about the noise that iron-rimmed wagon wheels made on stone streets, and decided that something had to be done about it. The context for this decree matters. By the middle of the 1st century BC, Rome had already grown into a city of extraordinary size and complexity. The population, which would reach its peak of around 1 million under the early empire, was already hundreds of thousands strong and pressing hard against the city's capacity to function. The streets, which had evolved rather than been designed, were increasingly clogged with the traffic of commerce, the wagons and carts that brought food, building materials, goods, and waste in and out of the city in a continuous, overlapping flow. The noise generated by this traffic was not a background hum. It was a defining feature of Roman urban life, in a way that most modern city dwellers, accustomed as we are to the white noise of engines, cannot easily imagine. Iron wheels on stone produce a sound that is sharp, metallic, and deeply penetrating, not merely loud, but possessing a particular quality of aggressive intrusion that cuts through walls and sleep alike. The wheels of Roman carts and wagons were not cushioned by rubber or any other yielding material. They met the stone paving of Rome's streets with iron-on-stone directness, and the result was a sound that Juvenal compared, not entirely hyperbolically, to an earthquake in progress. Beyond the wheels themselves, the vehicles brought with them the sounds of the animals that pulled them: mules, donkeys, and oxen. The primary draft animals of the Roman commercial world were not quiet creatures under normal circumstances. Under the pressure of hauling heavy loads through narrow, crowded streets, with their drivers urging them on with voice and whip, they were considerably less quiet. The combination of iron wheels, braying animals, shouting drivers, and the general mechanical percussion of a heavily loaded vehicle navigating ancient streets produced a composite sound that was, by any measure, extraordinary in its volume and its persistence. Caesar's edict addressed this specifically by removing the vehicles from the daytime city. The exceptions built into the legislation revealed the sophisticated thinking behind it. Certain categories of vehicle were exempted from the daytime ban. Wagons bringing building materials to construction projects already begun. Caesar was a great builder and could not afford to stop his building programs. The vehicles used in official religious processions, and the carts of the Vestal Virgins, whose sacred status placed them above ordinary traffic regulations. Later interpretations and expansions of the law also allowed for the vehicles of visiting magistrates and dignitaries, and for the transport of waste out of the city, because a city that could not remove its waste would face problems considerably worse than noise. What is remarkable about this list of exemptions is what it reveals about Roman priorities. The sacred comes before the practical, as it always does in Roman public life. The Vestal Virgins, the priestesses who maintained the sacred flame of Rome, could travel by vehicle at any hour because their religious function trumped civic regulation. Official religious processions could use vehicles because the religious life of the city was understood as foundational to its existence in a way that ordinary commerce was not. And construction could continue because Caesar himself needed it to continue, and also because the practical understanding was that stopping all construction would cause more disruption than the noise it generated. But the meat of the edict, the actual daily experience it created, was a daytime Rome cleared of its wheeled commercial traffic. And what this meant in practice was an extraordinary transformation of the urban soundscape during the daylight hours. The specific, penetrating, wall-shaking thunder of iron wheels on stone was removed from the city's days. What remained? The voices of vendors and pedestrians, the sounds of workshops, the inevitable clamor of 1 million people going about their business was still substantial by any standard. But it was a different kind of noise. It was, one might say, a more human noise. The merchants and traders who had previously relied on wheeled vehicles to bring their goods into the city during the day had to adapt. Most did so by shifting their deliveries to the permitted nighttime hours, which created, as we will explore in detail in the next chapter, an entirely new set of acoustic problems. Some adopted the use of porters and hand-carried loads for smaller deliveries during daylight. Others consolidated their operations, bringing larger loads during the permitted nighttime window to reduce the total number of nocturnal journeys necessary. The enforcement of the edict is a fascinating question in its own right, because Rome's capacity for civic enforcement was genuinely limited by modern standards. There was no professional police force of the kind we would recognize, the various bodies that existed, from the vigils who watched for fires to the urban cohorts who maintained order, were not traffic enforcement officers. Enforcement was likely largely social, a matter of community pressure, denunciation, and the occasional intervention of a local magistrate when things got particularly flagrant. That the law was known and generally observed, not perfectly, but generally is suggested by the fact that Roman writers refer to it as a real feature of their daily experience rather than as a dead letter. Juvenal's complaint about the nocturnal noise of wagons, for instance, is predicated on the understanding that those wagons are not present during the day, that the daytime and nighttime soundscapes of Rome are genuinely different, shaped by this legislation. If the law had simply been ignored, the distinction would not have existed. After Caesar's assassination in March of 44 BC, ironically, the very year the Lex Iulia Municipalis was formalized, the noise ordinances survived him. This is perhaps the most telling indication of their practical value, even in the chaos of the subsequent civil wars. Even through the political upheavals that transformed the Republic into the Empire, Caesar's traffic restrictions remained in place. Augustus, Caesar's adoptive heir and the first Roman emperor, maintained and extended them. Claudius added provisions for wheeled traffic in cities throughout Italy, not just Rome itself. The Antonine emperors, Trajan, Adrian, Antoninus, Pius, Marcus Aurelius, operated within a framework of traffic regulation that had its roots in Caesar's original decree. It had become, in the truest sense, Roman law, not the property of its creator, but of the civilization that had adopted it, shaped it, and made it its own. Chapter 4. The Architecture of Quiet, How Romans Built Against Sound. Stone does not lie. It records, in its thickness and its arrangement, the intentions and the anxieties of the people who placed it there. And when we look carefully at the physical remains of Roman domestic architecture, the houses, the villas, the apartments, the palatial estates, we find written in their walls a sustained, sophisticated, and often ingenious attempt to negotiate with the inescapable noise of Roman urban life. Architecture is, among many other things, a technology of separation. It separates inside from outside, warmth from cold, private from public, and it separates sound, or tries to. The degree to which Roman architecture succeeded in this acoustic ambition varied enormously depending on who was building, how much money they had, and where in the city they were building. But the attempt itself is unmistakable, and tracing it through the physical remains of the Roman world reveals a culture that thought carefully and creatively about its built environment as an acoustic instrument. At the top of the social and economic hierarchy, the ideal Roman house, the domos, was designed around a principle of progressive acoustic insulation that worked by increasing distance from the street through a series of carefully ordered interior spaces. A visitor entering a wealthy Roman house from the street would pass first through the fautes, a narrow entrance corridor into the atrium, the central hall of the house, open to the sky above through the impluvium, the rectangular opening in the roof. The atrium was public-facing and relatively noisy by design. This was where clients came to pay their respects in the morning, where business was transacted, where the social performance of Roman domestic life took place. Beyond the atrium, however, lay a different world, moving deeper into the domus. Through the tablinum, the study or reception room of the paterfamilias, one reached the peristyle garden, the colonnaded courtyard that formed the interior heart of the wealthy Roman house. This space was not merely aesthetically pleasing, though it was certainly that. It was acoustically strategic, surrounded on all sides by the house itself, with the colonnade providing a further buffer of air and mass between the open garden and the street beyond. The peristyle garden represented a genuine acoustic sanctuary within the urban fabric. The sound of running water from a fountain at the garden center, if the family was wealthy enough, further masked whatever urban noise penetrated this far, creating what acousticians today would recognize as acoustic masking. The use of pleasant, controllable sound to render unpleasant, uncontrollable sound less intrusive. The cubicula, the sleeping chambers, were typically located in the deepest and most interior parts of the house, as far as possible from the street. This was not accidental. Roman domestic architecture understood, even without the vocabulary of modern acoustics, that distance from the noise source was the most reliable form of acoustic protection. Thick walls, multiple intervening spaces, and the mass of the house itself between the sleeper and the street provided what passive acoustic protection the technology of the age could offer. The materials of Roman construction were, in some ways, excellent acoustic insulators. The thick concrete and brick walls of Roman buildings had genuine mass, and mass, in acoustic terms, is resistance. Sound energy must work against mass to transmit through it, and the greater the mass, the greater the resistance. A Roman concrete wall of sufficient thickness and wealthy. Roman house walls were often substantial, provided real acoustic attenuation for mid-range and low-frequency sounds. For very loud, very low-frequency sounds, such as the iron wheels of a heavy wagon on a paved street directly outside, even substantial walls were of limited help. But for the more moderate sounds of daily urban life, Roman construction offered meaningful protection. Mosaic floors, another characteristic feature of wealthy Roman domestic architecture, had their own minor acoustic contribution. The thick, dense substrate required to support a mosaic provided some degree of impact sound isolation between floors in multi-story buildings. This was probably not the primary motivation for mosaic floors. Aesthetics and the display of wealth were far more powerful drivers, but it was a secondary benefit that the occupants would have noticed. The thermae, the great public baths, present a fascinating acoustic case study, because they were among the noisiest environments in Rome, and they were also, paradoxically, among the most acoustically sophisticated buildings the Romans constructed. The great barrel vaults and domed ceilings of the imperial bath complexes, structures like the baths of Caracalla or the baths of Diocletian, which survive in substantial form today, created interior acoustic environments of extraordinary complexity. The long reverberation times of these great vaulted halls meant that sound, once generated, did not dissipate quickly. It lingered, accumulated, and blended with new sounds in a continuous acoustic tapestry that was, in its way, both wonderful and maddening. But the designers of the imperial bath complexes also understood that different spaces within the baths required different acoustic qualities. The frigidarium, the cold bathing hall with its great vaulted ceiling, was understood to be an inherently resonant, communal space. The smaller, more private bathing rooms were built at lower scale and with more intimate proportions, creating a more contained acoustic environment. The spaces reserved for reading and intellectual conversation, some bath complexes included. Libraries were situated away from the noisiest bathing areas, though whether they were ever truly quiet is another question. For the vast majority of Rome's population, the residents of the insulae, the apartment blocks, the architectural situation was dramatically different and dramatically worse. The insula was not designed around acoustic privacy. It was designed around the maximization of rentable floor area within the constraints of a narrow urban plot. Walls between adjacent apartments were frequently thin. The structural requirements of a multi-story building meant that the ground floor walls were necessarily thicker, but upper floors could, and often did, have partition walls of very modest thickness. The floors between stories, constructed of timber beams and planking, transmitted footsteps, voices, and the sounds of domestic activity from one level to the next, with remarkable fidelity. There is evidence from Pompeii and Herculaneum, the two cities buried by the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 AD, whose preservation gives us our most detailed picture of Roman urban domestic life, that even within modest means, residents made small architectural interventions to manage noise and other sensory intrusions. The positioning of internal partitions to create vestibules between the street and the main living space, the use of heavy door curtains, velaria to block both sound and draft, the placement of water features in small internal courtyards, even in relatively modest houses, all of these suggest a population that was not merely passive in the face of its acoustic environment, but actively, creatively responsive to it within the limits of its means. The most explicit architectural response to noise in the Roman world, however, belongs not to domestic architecture but to a peculiar urban solution that appears in some of the more congested neighborhoods, the dead-end alley, or blind court. In certain parts of Rome and Pompeii, streets terminated in cul-de-sacs that gave access to a small cluster of dwellings. These spaces, by their geometry, reduced the flow-through traffic that generated so much continuous noise. They were quieter, not by any acoustic treatment of the walls themselves, but by the simple expedient of reducing the number of people and vehicles that had reason to enter them. Urban form as acoustic management, the idea has a pleasing elegance about it. Wealth, ultimately, was the most effective acoustic technology available to the ancient Roman. The wealthy could build houses with thick walls and deep setbacks from the street. They could design interior gardens and water features that created acoustic refuges within the urban fabric. They could retreat entirely to country villas when the city became intolerable. The poor had none of these options. They lived on upper floors of thin-walled buildings directly above noisy commercial streets, with nothing between them and the full acoustic assault of Roman urban life, but whatever they could improvise from the materials and money they had. This is not a uniquely Roman observation. It is, in fact, a feature of urban acoustic life that has changed remarkably little in 2000 years, but it is worth naming clearly in the Roman context, because the history of Rome's noise management is in significant part a history of the acoustic privileges of the wealthy and the acoustic sufferings of everyone else. Chapter 5. The Night Shift. When the carts came rolling, there is a particular quality to darkness that changes the character of sound, not its volume. Sound does not become louder at night simply because there is less light, but its apparent intensity. In the silence of a sleeping city, each individual sound stands out with the clarity it lacks during the crowded, competing noise of the day. The crack of a wagon wheel against a stone, the bray of a mule, the shout of a driver navigating a dark, narrow street by the light of a single lamp. These sounds reached the wakened sleeper not as part of a general roar, but as specific intrusions, each one separate and complete in its ability to destroy the fragile architecture of sleep. Julius Caesar's great traffic ordinance had cleared Rome's daytime streets of their wheeled commercial traffic. This was, in the immediate experience of Rome's daytime inhabitants, a genuine improvement. The specific thunder of iron-rimmed wheels on stone was removed from the days of the city, replaced by a soundscape, still busy but different in character, more human, more variable, more punctuated by silence. For those who conducted their business and their social lives during daylight hours, which was the great majority of Rome's free population, the ordinance represented a real and tangible change in the quality of daily life. But Rome needed to be fed. Rome needed its building materials delivered. Rome needed its wine and its oil and its grain and its timber and its marble. A city of 1 million people consumed staggering quantities of everything, every single day, without pause, without rest. The supply chains that fed this consumption did not stop because Caesar had restricted daytime traffic. They adapted, and the adaptation was entirely predictable. The carts and wagons and supply vehicles that had previously moved through Rome during the day simply moved through Rome during the night instead. The Roman night became, in consequence of Caesar's daytime ban, one of the noisiest nocturnal environments in the ancient world. From the hour when the permitted window opened, approximately 2 hours before sunset, until well past midnight, and sometimes through to dawn, the streets of Rome thundered with the passage of the supply wagons that kept the city alive. The effect was captured by Roman writers with a kind of exhausted black humor that speaks to its daily reality. Juvenal, as we have already noted, described it in Satire 3 with the vividness of a man who had experienced it personally and recently. The wagons that could wake the deepest sleeper, the shouting of the drovers, the general acoustic pandemonium of a city that had solved its daytime noise problem by transporting it wholesale into the night. The specific sounds of the Roman night supply chain were distinctive and, for those trying to sleep, deeply unpleasant. The wagons themselves, the plostrum for heavy freight, the carus for lighter loads, the archera for covered transport, were substantial wooden vehicles whose iron-rimmed wheels produced, as we have established, a sound of considerable penetrating power, fully laden with the goods they were delivering: sacks of grain, amphorae of wine, blocks of stone, beams of timber. They were heavy enough to make the stone paving vibrate under their passage. The narrow streets of Rome's residential neighborhoods channeled this vibration and amplified the airborne sound waves, bouncing them off the closely packed factors of the insulae and delivering them, concentrated and inescapable, into the rooms of sleeping citizens. The draft animals that pulled these wagons were a noise source in their own right. Mules and donkeys, the most common draft animals for urban delivery in Rome, are not naturally quiet creatures, and they were considerably less quiet when being worked through the dark, narrow streets of a crowded city in the middle of the night. Their braying, their stamping, the jingling of their harness and the creak of their traces, all of this contributed to the nocturnal soundscape. The drivers, meanwhile, communicated with their animals and with one another through voice, shouts of warning, instruction, and occasional abuse that added a human layer to the mechanical and animal noise of the night convoy. Beyond the supply wagons, the Roman night contained other persistent noise sources that Caesar's ordinance had not addressed. The felons, the laundry workers, fullers, whose business involved the stamping and processing of cloth in vats of urine and other chemicals, often worked through the night, and their establishments, typically located in residential neighborhoods for reasons of access to water, contributed their own distinctive acoustic signature. The rhythmic stamping of feet, the sloshing of liquid, the occasional shout or song of workers keeping their spirits up through a long shift. The thermopolia Rome's equivalent of fast food establishments, where prepared hot food was sold from counters built into the street frontage of buildings, operated late into the evening and sometimes through the night to serve workers returning from their shifts and revelers making their way home. The sounds of cooking, the clattering of vessels, and above all, the voices of customers and proprietors in the particular register of people conducting transactions late at night added to the nocturnal acoustic environment. The tabernae shops that were built into the ground floors of insulae and that opened directly onto the street through wide-arched openings were sometimes also operating after dark, particularly those engaged in trades that were better conducted without the heat of the day. The blacksmiths, the bronze workers, the potters who could not stop their kilners on a schedule. These contributed their particular industrial sounds to the night. And then there were the fire brigades, the vigils, the night watchmen, and firefighters, established by Augustus in 06 AD, patrolled Rome's streets through the night, and their rounds, while essential to the safety of a city perpetually threatened by fire, were not conducted in silence. The vigils were military in organization and in manner, and their passage through the streets of Rome at night was marked by the sound of arms and equipment, of voices calling out, of the occasional alarm when fire or crime was detected. The Romans who wrote about all of this did so with a quality of resigned suffering that is crossed to millennia, entirely recognizable to anyone who has lived near a busy delivery route or a nighttime commercial strip. Seneca, who, in his letter from above the bathhouse, claims to have achieved philosophical equanimity in the face of daytime noise, is rather less equanimous when he writes in other contexts about the loss of sleep. Sleep, for Seneca, as for any Stoic, was not a luxury, but a biological necessity, a requirement of the rational mind's proper functioning. A citizen who could not sleep, could not think clearly, could not exercise virtue, could not participate fully in the life of reason that Stoicism required. The noisy night was therefore not merely an inconvenience, but a genuine impediment to the philosophical life. Martial's epigrams about night noise have a different quality, more darkly comic, less philosophically anguished. He writes about the mule driver whose shouts could penetrate walls, about the baker who fired up his ovens in the dark hours before dawn, about the general conspiracy of the Roman night against the body's need for rest. Martial's humor is the humor of a man who has given up expecting actual relief and has decided instead to make literature from his suffering, a response that is, in its way, deeply Roman. The medical writers of the Roman world, Galen, most prominently, whose prodigious output covered virtually every aspect of human health from the 2nd century AD perspective, were clear about the relationship between sleep deprivation and physical health in terms that anticipate modern understanding with surprising accuracy. Galen argued that disturbed sleep impaired the body's ability to restore itself, weakened the humoral balance, and made individuals more susceptible to disease. He noted that inhabitants of noisy parts of Rome were, in his clinical observation, more likely to present with symptoms of nervous exhaustion and chronic illness than those who managed to achieve regular, undisturbed sleep. This is not merely interesting as medical history. It establishes that the Roman medical establishment understood, in the framework of its own theoretical system, that the noise of the city was not merely an annoyance but a health issue, a cause of real physical harm to real bodies. Whether this medical understanding influenced policy in any direct way is difficult to say. The Roman state was not consistently responsive to medical opinion in the way that modern public health systems aspire to be, but the recognition existed, was articulated clearly, and was part of the broader conversation about noise that Roman intellectual culture was conducting throughout the imperial period. The night, in ancient Rome, was never truly Rome's friend. It was the time of crime and fire, of dark streets and uncertain safety. Caesar's ordinance had made it also the time of noise. The city that needed to move its goods had moved them into the darkness, and the Roman night echoed accordingly with the sound of its own survival. Chapter 6. The Forum, the Baths, and the Market, Public Noise Zones. Every city has its geography of noise, places where sound is expected, accepted, even welcomed as the acoustic signature of a space doing what it is supposed to do. The Roman city understood this geography with great clarity, even without the vocabulary of urban planning or acoustic zoning. Certain spaces were known to be loud. Certain spaces were understood to require a modicum of quiet, and the navigation between these acoustic zones was one of the daily social skills that every Roman urban inhabitant acquired and exercised, consciously or not, from childhood. The Roman Forum, the Fora, as the various interconnected public spaces of Rome's civic center should properly be called, was the loudest civic space in the ancient Western world. In the narrow technical sense, it was the louder because it was the most important. The Forum Romanum, the ancient center of Roman civic and commercial life, was the place where law courts conducted their business, where political speeches were delivered, where commercial transactions of every scale were negotiated, where the social life of the Republic and later the Empire played out in its most concentrated form. Every function the Forum served was a function that required voice, and every voice added to the total acoustic output of a space that was already, by its physical nature, highly The Basilicae, the great covered halls that bordered the Forum Romanum and served as the main venues for the law courts, were particularly notable acoustic environments. The Basilica Julia, built by Julius Caesar and completed under Augustus, stretched along the south side of the Forum in a vast structure of multiple aisles and soaring vaulted ceilings. Within this building, multiple courts operated simultaneously, separated only by wooden screens that provided visual, but essentially no acoustic separation. Advocates, Roman lawyers were called advocates, and the Roman legal tradition placed great emphasis on rhetorical performance in court, competed for the attention of their judges and juries against the simultaneous arguments of their colleagues in adjacent courts. This acoustic chaos was apparently a recognized feature of legal practice in Rome, because Roman rhetorical training explicitly addressed the challenge of speaking loudly and clearly enough to be heard over competing noise. Quintilian, the great teacher of rhetoric whose Institutio Oratoria is one of the most comprehensive guides to Roman public speaking to survive, discusses the physical demands of advocacy, the need for a strong voice, for clear projection, for the ability to maintain intelligibility in a noisy environment. The Roman advocate who could not project his voice adequately was, in the most literal sense, at a professional disadvantage. The fora of the imperial period, the fora of Caesar Augustus, Nerva, Trajan added to the total sonic mass of Rome's civic center, with their markets, their temples, their porticos, filled with philosophical discussion, commercial negotiation, and social interaction. Trajan's Forum, the largest and most elaborate of the imperial fora, included a great market complex, the Mercati di Riano, which still stands today in substantial form. That was a multi-story commercial center housing hundreds of individual shops and stalls across its curved facade. The acoustic environment of this market in full operation must have been extraordinary. The voices of hundreds of vendors and customers, the sounds of transactions, the movement of goods, all concentrated within the curved stone structure that formed its outer wall and reflected sound back into the space with generous amplitude. The public baths, the thermae in their various scales, from the vast imperial complexes to the neighborhood balnea, occupied a different position in Rome's acoustic geography. They were loud, certainly. Seneca's letter is our most detailed testimony to the acoustic character of the bath, and we will examine it thoroughly in the following chapter. But the baths were loud in a way that was socially complex. The noise of the baths was, in a sense, the noise of leisure, of voluntary social engagement, of the body being pleasurably attended to. It was different in quality from the noise of commerce or construction, even when it was similar in volume. The Roman bath was also an institution with remarkably democratic acoustic implications. In a city where the wealthy could insulate themselves from noise by the architecture of their houses and the depth of their pockets, the bath was one of the few places where all social classes, men of senatorial rank alongside freed slaves, merchants alongside craftsmen, shared the same acoustic environment. Everyone who entered the baths of Caracalla or the neighborhood balnea submitted themselves to the same sonic landscape, the same splashing, shouting, grunting, singing, sales pitching, conversation, and general human clamor. This shared acoustic experience was part of what made the bath such a central institution in Roman social life. It was one of the few truly common spaces, in every sense. The markets, the macella, and the various specialized market spaces that served different categories of goods were the third major public noise zone of the Roman city, and in some ways the most relentless. The market had no off hours in the way that, say, the law courts or the baths did. Commerce in Rome was conducted from before dawn until well into the evening, and the market was the engine of that commerce. The fishmongers, the meat sellers, the fruit and vegetable vendors, the spice merchants, the textile dealers, the potters, the second-hand goods traders, each category of vendor contributed its specific acoustic texture to the market's total sound. The fish market, the Forum Piscarium, was particularly noted in Roman writing for its distinctive and aggressive sonic environment. Fish selling in the ancient world was conducted under considerable time pressure, because without refrigeration, the goods deteriorated rapidly, which gave the vendors an excellent incentive to sell as loudly and as persistently as possible. The urgency of the sale was expressed through the voice, and Roman satirists returned repeatedly to the figure of the fish seller as the archetype of aggressive commercial noise. Roman social code regarding noise in these public spaces was complex and in some ways counterintuitive. There was no general expectation of quiet in the forum or the market. Such an expectation would have been absurd on its face, since the entire purpose of these spaces was the conduct of noisy human business. But there were specific situations within public spaces where noise was regulated by social convention and, in some cases, by law. The arrival of a magistrate or a senator of sufficient rank might briefly quiet a portion of the forum, as those present showed respect. The conduct of a religious ceremony in or near a public space imposed a temporary requirement of silence on those nearby, and the deliberations of the Senate, conducted in the Curia Julia on the north side of the Forum, required the kind of focused acoustic environment in which individual voices could be heard, which meant that the immediate surroundings of the Curia were subject to informal but real social pressure to maintain a level of quiet that the rest of the Forum most emphatically was not. The Roman solution to the acoustic character of its public spaces was not, primarily, architectural or legislative. It was behavioral and cultural. Romans learned to modulate their voices differently in different spaces, to pitch their speech for the reverberant interior of a basilica versus the open air of the forum versus the intimate space of a private dining room. They learned to conduct their business in the market with the volume the market required, and to conduct their social conversations in the porticos with a different register. They learned, in short, to be acoustically sophisticated city dwellers in the way that inhabitants of any dense urban environment must be, not by eliminating noise, which was impossible, but by navigating it with skill, by finding within it the pockets of relative quiet that could serve their needs, and by developing the social and cultural practices that made communal life in a very loud place not merely tolerable, but, remarkably often, enjoyable. The bath, the market, the forum, these were not merely loud places to be endured. They were the living heart of Rome, places of genuine pleasure and social connection for millions of people whose private lives, in cramped, dark, noisy apartments, offered little of either. The noise of these places was the sound of Rome being Rome, and while individual Romans might retreat from it when they could, and complain about it eloquently when they couldn't, the noise of Rome's public spaces was also, in some deeply held and not always articulated way, the sound of the city's life, and no Roman, however exhausted, however sleep-deprived, however articulately outraged, would have wished that life entirely away. Chapter 7. Seneca's Letters, a philosopher above a bathhouse. There is a letter that has survived 2,000 years, passed down through the patient hands of monks and scholars and scribes, copied onto parchment and papyrus, and eventually into the digital permanence of our own age. That reads less like a philosophical treatise and more like a dispatch from the edge of sanity. It is the 56th letter of Lucius Annius Seneca to his friend Gaius Lucilius Jr., written sometime around 63 or 64 AD, in the final years of Seneca's life. And it begins with a sentence that any apartment dweller in any city in any century can read and feel, in the pit of their chest, a deep and immediate recognition. "Let me die," Seneca writes. If silence is as necessary for the student as it seems to be, he is being rhetorical, of course. He is a Stoic philosopher, and Stoic philosophers do not die because of noise. But the exasperation behind the rhetoric is entirely genuine. because Seneca is, at the moment of writing this letter, living above a bathhouse, and the bathhouse is, as it always is, open for business. To understand the full significance of Seneca's letter, its importance not merely as a personal document, but as a historical record of Roman acoustic life, we need, first, to understand who Seneca was, and what it meant for a man of his position to be living above a bathhouse. Lucius Aeneas Seneca was born in Cordoba, in what is now Spain, around 04 BC, and came to Rome as a child. He was educated in the Stoic philosophy that would define his intellectual life, trained in rhetoric and law, and rose through the complex hierarchies of Roman public life to become one of the most powerful men in the empire. He served as tutor and then as chief advisor to the young Emperor Nero, shaping the policies of the early Neronian period in ways that later historians have generally praised. He was also, through a combination of imperial favor and shrewd estate management, one of the wealthiest men in Rome. A man of Seneca's wealth and status did not need to live above a bathhouse. He had country estates and grand urban properties at his disposal. The choice to be in a building adjacent to or above a bathing establishment was therefore either a deliberate philosophical experiment, the Stoic testing himself against the conditions of ordinary life, or an episode of the kind of practical constraint that even wealthy Romans sometimes faced when in the wrong city at the wrong time. The letter itself does not fully explain the circumstances. What it does do is describe, with extraordinary precision and literary artistry, exactly what Seneca could hear from his rooms above the bath, and exactly what he claimed to think and feel about it. The catalogue of sounds that Seneca provides in letter 56 is worth reproducing in its essential architecture, because it is not merely a list, it is a taxonomy. Seneca hears, and names, and characterizes each sound he encounters as a naturalist might characterize species. The strong man exercising with heavy weights, whose grunts of effort reach Seneca's ears with metronomic regularity. The man who is content with cheaper exercise, Seneca's slightly snobbish phrasing, whose efforts produce a different, less impressive sound. The slap of the masseur's hands against the body of his client, which Seneca distinguishes as varying in sound, depending on whether the masseur is striking with a flat hand or a cupped hand, a distinction that reveals a man who's been listening to this for some time and has become involuntarily expert in it. The plunge of the swimmer who throws himself into the pool and strikes the water with maximum dramatic effect. The voice of the depilator, the hair removal specialist, raised in an artificially high pitch to attract clients, interrupted periodically by the shrieks of those clients when the removal is more vigorous than anticipated. And then the vendors. The sausage seller who cries his wares in a distinctive descending cadence. The pastry seller with his own particular call. The drink seller with his own, each with a separate voice, a separate pitch, a separate rhythm, and together producing. Seneca notes, with the precision of a man who has had ample time to study the phenomenon, a truly remarkable sonic environment. Seneca's enumeration is remarkable on several levels simultaneously. It is remarkable as literature, the compression, the wit, the perfectly calibrated irony of a great writer at the height of his powers. It is remarkable as social history. Each sound Seneca names corresponds to a specific economic and social reality of the Roman bath, allowing us to reconstruct from his acoustic map a vivid picture of the institution in full operation. And it is remarkable as philosophy, because having established beyond any possible doubt that the environment he inhabits is extraordinarily, almost heroically noisy, Seneca then pivots to the argument that this does not matter, that a mind properly trained in Stoic philosophy cannot be disturbed by external noise, that the sounds of the bathhouse below him are irrelevant to a man who has achieved mastery over his inner life. This is the philosophical core of the letter, and it is both deeply interesting and not entirely convincing. Seneca argues for what we might today call acoustic equanimity, the capacity to maintain mental focus and emotional stability in a noisy environment through the exercise of will and philosophical discipline rather than through any physical change in the environment itself. He cites examples of Stoic masters who worked and thought in noisy conditions without apparent difficulty. He argues that it is the mind's attachment to quiet rather than noise itself. That is the real problem, that the philosopher who requires silence to think has not yet achieved true philosophical mastery. This argument has a genuine philosophical power, and it connects to something real in the Stoic tradition. The distinction between what is within our control, our judgments, our responses, our inner states, and what is not, the external world, including its sounds. Seneca is arguing, in essence, that the acoustic environment of Rome is in the category of things not within our control, and that wisdom consists not in changing such things, but in changing our relationship to them. But there is a tension in the letter that Seneca himself seems aware of. He admits that some sounds are more difficult to ignore than others, specifically the shrill and piercing sounds, as opposed to the continuous and low-level ones. He acknowledges that his own practice of working in this environment is a deliberate exercise in Stoic discipline, not a default state of enlightened calm. He is, in other words, working at this. The equanimity he describes is not effortless, it is effortful, and its effort is part of the point. This distinction matters enormously for understanding the Roman relationship to noise more broadly. Seneca's letter is not evidence that educated Romans were indifferent to noise. It is evidence of the opposite, that noise was sufficiently troubling, sufficiently present, sufficiently capable of disrupting the intellectual and emotional life, that a philosopher of the first rank felt it necessary to develop and articulate a sophisticated theoretical framework for coping with it. You do not write a philosophical treatise on how to endure something that does not bother you. Seneca's letter is, at its heart, a testimony to how much noise bothered him and how hard he worked not to let it show. The letter also contains, almost in passing, an observation that has struck many subsequent readers as the most practically useful thing in it. Seneca notes that he is more disturbed by the sounds of people trying to be quiet, the muffled footstep, the suppressed cough, the whispered conversation that is conscious of being overheard, than by the frank, open, unapologetic noise of the bathhouse below. Noise that makes no pretense of being otherwise, he suggests, is in some ways easier to habituate to than noise that is half-silent, because the half-silent noise constantly draws the attention with its very effort at concealment, while the frank noise can eventually be processed as background. This is a genuine insight, one that modern acoustic psychology has confirmed in its own vocabulary. The intermittent, unpredictable sound, the sound that appears and disappears, that demands renewed attention with each recurrence, is psychologically more disruptive than the continuous, predictable sound that the brain can learn to process as ambient. Seneca had arrived at this understanding not through experimental psychology but through careful introspective observation during what was, essentially, a prolonged involuntary experiment in noise exposure. Beyond letter LVIA, Seneca's broader philosophical writing returns repeatedly to the theme of the need for occasional solitude and quiet as prerequisites for the examined life. In his essay, De Tranquilitate Animi, on the tranquility of the mind, he argues that the perpetual stimulation of the city, of which noise is a primary component, is corrosive to the inner life in ways that even a Stoic must take seriously. The city bombards the senses. The senses, overstimulated, cannot perform their proper function of delivering accurate information to the reasoning mind. The reasoning mind, deprived of accurate sensory information and perpetually distracted by the clamor of urban life, cannot achieve the calm, focused contemplation that philosophical development requires. This is, in the framework of Roman Stoicism, an argument for periodic retreat from noise, not because noise is inherently evil or because the Stoic cannot cope with it in principle, but because the human organism has limits, and the wise person acknowledges those limits and manages them intelligently. Seneca retreated to his country properties. He structured his urban life to include periods of deliberate withdrawal from the social world. He understood, in other words, that the theoretical argument for acoustic equanimity and the practical reality of human neurological limits were not the same thing, and that a philosophy worth following had to accommodate both. The legacy of Seneca's letter extends far beyond Rome. It was read and discussed throughout the medieval period, when Seneca was one of the most admired of the ancient philosophers. Among Christian scholars who found in his moral philosophy much that resonated with their own ethical traditions, it was read by Renaissance humanists who saw in it a meditation on the conditions of intellectual work that felt directly relevant to their own urban lives. It has been cited by psychologists, acoustic engineers, architects, and urban planners who find in it not merely a historical curiosity, but a genuine and early contribution to the literature on noise and human well-being. And it has been read, countless times, by people sitting in apartments above sources of noise, not bathhouses perhaps, but bars, restaurants, laundromats, subway lines, delivery bays, who pick up the 2,000-year-old letter and find in it the particular comfort of knowing that their misery has excellent historical company. that the finest philosophical mind of the 1st century AD sat in a room above a noise source and felt exactly what they feel, and found it exactly as hard, and worked exactly as hard to cope with it. That the problem they face today was faced before, and faced thoughtfully, and not entirely solved, and that the not entirely solving of it is itself part of the human condition, as Roman as a toga, and as modern as a noise-cancelling headphone. Chapter 8. The Law speaks Roman legal codes and noise. Roman law is one of the great intellectual achievements of human civilization. Over the course of roughly 1,000 years, from the early Republic through the height of the Empire and into the Byzantine period, Roman jurists developed a body of legal thought so comprehensive, so logically rigorous, and so practically sophisticated that it became the foundation on which virtually all Western legal systems are built. Modern contract law, property law, tort law, procedural law, all of these trace their ancestry, directly or indirectly, to the work of Roman legal thinkers whose names survive in the great compilation known as the Corpus Juris Civilis, assembled under the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century AD. Within this vast legal edifice, noise occupies a surprisingly prominent and revealing place. Not as a single, unified body of noise law, the Romans did not think in the modern regulatory categories of noise, ordinance, and decibel limit, but as a thread running through multiple areas of legal concern, surfacing repeatedly in property disputes, tort claims, municipal regulations, and the general principles of Roman law governing the relationship between neighbors and between citizens and the state. To follow this thread through Roman legal sources is to discover a legal system grappling seriously and intelligently with questions about noise that our own legal systems are still debating today. The most important Roman legal concept for understanding noise law is the octio aquae pluviae arsandae, the action against rainwater damage, and its evolution into the broader concept of immiscio, the unlawful projection of something from one's own property into a neighbor's property. Roman law recognized, from an early period, that property ownership did not include the unlimited right to use one's property in ways that interfered with a neighbor's enjoyment of theirs. The legal question was always one of degree and of reasonableness. What level of interference was the ordinary, expected consequence of normal use of property, and what level crossed the line into something legally actionable? Noise entered this framework as a specific instance of immiscio. The jurist Gaius, writing in the 2nd century AD, and one of the foundational figures of Roman legal thought, addressed the question of noise-generating activities in the context of neighboring properties, with a nuance that is remarkably sophisticated. The key distinction in Roman law was between the use of one's property in ways that inevitably and normally generated noise, a blacksmith operating a forge, a baker running an oven, a fuller treating cloth, and the use of property in ways that generated excessive, unusual, or deliberately hostile noise that went beyond what a reasonable neighbor could be expected to tolerate. This distinction between ordinary and extraordinary noise reflects a legal philosophy that understood property rights not as absolute, but as existing. In a web of mutual obligations and reasonable expectations, the Roman law concept of the bonus paterfamilias, the good head of household, the reasonable person of Roman law, provided the standard against which conduct was measured. Would a reasonable Roman, operating his property in the normal way of his trade or calling, generate this level of noise? If yes, the neighbor had no legal claim. If the noise exceeded what normal, reasonable use of property would generate, if it was excessive, unusual, or generated for no legitimate purpose, then the neighbor might have grounds for legal action. The Digest of Justinian, the great 6th century compilation of Roman legal opinion, that is our primary source for classical Roman jurisprudence, contains several passages that address noise directly. One of the most frequently cited comes from the jurist Ulpian, perhaps the greatest of the classical Roman jurists, who served as praetorian prefect under the Emperor Alexander Severus. In the early 3rd century AD, Ulpian addresses the question of a cheese shop, a fumigating establishment whose smoke and smell constituted an immiscio into neighboring properties, but his analysis of when such intrusions become legally actionable rests on principles of proportionality and reasonableness that apply equally to noise. The principle Ulpian articulates is essentially this: ordinary commercial activity, conducted in a normal and reasonable manner, generates intrusions upon neighboring properties, noise, smell, smoke, vibration, that neighbors must accept as the normal condition of urban life. But when those intrusions exceed what ordinary commercial activity would generate, or when they are conducted in an abnormal or unreasonable manner, they become legally actionable. The neighbor suffering from such excessive intrusion could seek relief through the praetor, the magistrate responsible for civil justice, either in the form of an injunction requiring the cessation of the offending activity, or in the form of damages for harm suffered. What is particularly interesting about this framework, from the perspective of noise management, is that it places the burden of reasonableness on both parties. The noise-generating business owner had the right to conduct their business in the normal way of their trade. The neighbor had the right to quiet enjoyment of their property up to the threshold of what normal commercial activity would generate. Neither party's rights were absolute, and the law required both parties to accommodate the other's legitimate needs up to the point where accommodation became genuinely unreasonable. This is a legal framework that is, in its essential structure, entirely recognizable in modern noise law. The concept of the reasonable neighbor, the distinction between ordinary and excessive intrusion, the balancing of competing property rights. These are principles that appear in virtually every modern legal system's approach to noise disputes, dressed in different vocabulary but built on the same logical foundation. Roman law did not invent these principles arbitrarily. It arrived at them through centuries of practical legal experience with the specific problems generated by urban density, and the solutions it developed were sufficiently robust and rational to be inherited, adapted, and transmitted through the legal tradition to the present day. Beyond property law, Roman law addressed noise through its provisions governing public order and the conduct of public life. The Lex Iulia, Divi Publica, the Julian law on public violence, and various senatorial decrees and imperial rescripts addressed disturbances of the public peace that had a noise component. Nighttime disturbances were particularly subject to legal sanction, partly because the night was already associated in Roman law with greater danger and greater need for public order, and partly because the nighttime disturbance of sleeping citizens was understood as a qualitatively different and more serious offense than daytime noise. The role of the aediles, the magistrates responsible for the management of Rome's public spaces, markets, and infrastructure, in noise regulation was significant and often underappreciated. The aediles had broad authority over the conduct of commercial activity in Rome's public spaces, and this authority extended to regulating the time, place, and manner of activities that generated excessive noise. Market vendors who conducted their business in prohibited locations, craftspeople who operated in neighborhoods where their noise-generating activities were restricted, tavern keepers whose establishments disturbed the peace, all of these fell within the aedilician jurisdiction. The edicts published by the aediles, short regulatory documents that specified the rules governing commercial activity in their jurisdiction, were a form of administrative noise regulation that complemented the more formal provisions of private law. The municipal charters that Rome established for the cities of its empire, documents like the Lex Arundatina, the municipal charter of the Spanish town of Erni, discovered in 1981, and one of the most important epigraphic discoveries of recent decades, revealed that Roman-style noise regulation extended throughout the empire. The Charter of Erni contains provisions regulating night traffic in the town, clearly modeled on Caesarian and later imperial legislation that established the same basic framework of nighttime delivery restrictions and traffic management that operated in Rome itself. This tells us something important. Noise management was not merely a Roman metropolitan concern, but a feature of Roman urban governance that was exported, along with aqueducts and amphitheaters and straight roads, to every corner of the empire. The Roman legal system also addressed noise in the specific context of the schools and philosophical establishments that were important. Institutions of urban intellectual life, schoolmasters who held their classes in public spaces, as many did, particularly at the elementary level, were subject to aedilician regulation regarding the time and location of their instruction. The notorious noise of Roman street schools, complained about by Martial and others, was not entirely unregulated. There were provisions, imperfectly enforced but genuinely existing, that attempted to restrict the most disruptive aspects of street-based teaching. Taken as a whole, Roman noise law represents something genuinely remarkable. A legal system that took seriously the acoustic dimensions of urban life, that developed principled frameworks for adjudicating noise disputes, and that embedded those frameworks in both private law and public regulation in ways that were transmitted, through the long continuity of the Western legal tradition, into the modern world. When a modern city council debates a noise ordinance, When a modern court adjudicates a nuisance claim based on a neighbor's loud activities, when a modern property law textbook explains the doctrine of reasonable use, all of these, at some level of historical depth, are building on foundations that Roman jurists laid in the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era. The Romans did not solve noise, but they made it a legal problem. And in doing so, they took the crucial step of asserting that the acoustic environment was not merely a matter of personal tolerance or philosophical fortitude, but a subject of legitimate public and legal concern, a domain in which rights could be asserted, wrongs could be remedied, and the community could establish and enforce standards for the common good. Chapter 9. The country escape, villas, retreats, and the Roman dream of quiet. There is a particular kind of longing that runs through Roman literature like a silver thread, not the longing for power, or for love, or for immortality, though those are present too, but a simpler, older, more persistently human longing, the longing for quiet, for a place where the sound of one's own thoughts is louder than the sound of the city, for the particular quality of silence that exists not as the absence of all sound, but as the presence of sounds that do not demand, do not intrude, do not prevent sleep. The wind in trees, the sound of water, the distant call of a bird at dusk. The Romans called it otium. The word is usually translated as leisure, and that translation is not wrong, but it is incomplete. Otium meant more than the absence of work. It meant the presence of a particular kind of mental freedom, the freedom to think without interruption, to read without distraction, to write without the world pressing in. And in the Roman context, the pursuit of otium was inseparable from the pursuit of quiet, because the city that generated negotium, the antonym of otium, the busyness of public and commercial life, also generated the noise that made genuine otium impossible. The Roman country villa was the physical embodiment of the dream of otium. It was, among many other things, a productive agricultural enterprise, a social statement, a display of aesthetic refinement, a refuge from political danger, an acoustic sanctuary, a place deliberately and thoughtfully removed from the sources of urban noise, designed to provide its inhabitants with the silence that the city categorically refused to offer. The villas of the Roman elite ranged from the modest country houses of men of moderate means to the extraordinary, palatial complexes of the emperors and the very wealthy, but they shared certain physical characteristics that reflected shared acoustic intentions. They were, almost universally, located outside the city, at sufficient distance from urban centers to be beyond the reach of the wagon traffic, the market vendors, the hammering craftsmen, and the general human din of the town. This distance was itself the primary acoustic technology. Noise attenuates with distance, according to physical laws that the Romans understood empirically, if not mathematically, and the most reliable way to escape urban noise was simply to put enough air between yourself and the source. Within the villa, the design principles that reflected acoustic aspiration were often the same ones that reflected other aesthetic and practical values. The orientation of the house away from roads and toward gardens or water, the use of colonnaded garden spaces that created the psychological and acoustic sense of protected enclosure, the placement of libraries and study rooms in the most interior, most sheltered locations, the incorporation of water features, fountains, reflecting pools, the sound of a stream that provided the acoustic masking that gardens and suburban quiet alone might not fully supply. Gaius, Plinius, Caecilius, Secundus, Pliny the Younger, is our most articulate guide to the acoustic design of the Roman country villa, because Pliny thought carefully and wrote extensively about the physical environments in which he worked and relaxed, and because the letters in which he describes his two principal villas, the Laurentine villa on the coast south of Rome, and the Tuscan villa in the Apennine foothills, are extraordinarily detailed accounts of how a sophisticated Roman of the 2nd century AD arranged his physical world in relation to noise. The Laurentine villa, which Pliny describes in his letter to 17, was his winter retreat, close enough to Rome, about 17 miles down the Via Laurentina, to allow him to return to the city for official business when required, but far enough to provide genuine separation from urban life. Pliny's description of this villa is essentially an acoustic tour. He walks his correspondent through each room and space, noting the orientation, the relationship to sound sources and sound refuges, the way each space relates to the sounds of wind and sea and garden. The most revealing passage in Pliny's description of the Laurentine villa concerns his sleeping quarters. He describes a room, a dieta, that is set apart from the main body of the house, looking out over a garden, positioned so that it receives neither the sounds of the sea nor those of the wind, and so deeply embedded in the structure of the house that the sounds of the household's daily activities cannot reach it. This room, Pliny says, gives him true rest, the kind of deep, uninterrupted sleep that the city absolutely cannot provide. He describes it with a satisfaction that is not merely aesthetic but almost physical in its relief. The satisfaction of a man whose body has been given something it has desperately needed and not often received. The Tuscan villa, described in letter V6, is even more elaborate in its acoustic planning. Pliny describes a hippodrome, a large enclosed garden in the form of a riding track, surrounded by plane trees and boxes of clipped shrubs, a space specifically designed to be a place of tranquil exercise and contemplation, acoustically buffered from outside by the mass of the surrounding plantings and the distance from any road or settlement. Within this garden, Pliny tells us, one could hear the murmur of water, the sound of birds, and nothing else. Nothing that intruded from the world of human commerce and conflict beyond the villa's walls. Pliny also describes, in this same letter, a small summer house at the end of the hippodrome garden, a dieta, again that he uses specifically for writing and reading that requires concentrated thought. This small structure, set apart from the main villa, away from the garden, away from the household traffic, is Pliny's acoustic laboratory. A space deliberately designed and deliberately used for the production of intellectual work that the Roman city, with all its noise and social obligation, cannot accommodate. It is, in every essential respect, a writer's studio, and its existence in the letters of Pliny the Younger establishes clearly that the Roman elite not only felt the need for acoustic refuge, but actively designed and maintained physical spaces to serve that need. Quintus Horatius Flaccus, Horace provides a different, and in some ways more affecting perspective on the villa as acoustic refuge, because Horace's famous Sabine farm, the property given to him by his patron Maecenas in 33 BC, represented an acoustic salvation that he had not been born to expect and which he celebrated throughout. His poetry with the intensity of someone who knows the value of a gift because he remembers life without it. Horace had grown up in modest circumstances in Venusia, in southern Italy, had studied in Rome and then in Athens, had served in the ill-fated army of Brutus and Cassius at Philippi, and had returned to Rome after the Republican defeat to make his living as a poet in a city that was, by his own repeated testimony, making him slowly miserable. The Sabine farm changed everything. Horace's odes and satires and epistles return again and again to the contrast between the noise and stress and social obligation of Rome and the peace, the genuine, physical, acoustic peace of his farm in the Sabine Hills. His poetry on this theme has a quality of almost religious gratitude. The quiet of the farm is not merely pleasant, but restorative, not merely comfortable, but necessary. Without it, Horace seems to say in poem after poem, he could not write, could not think, could not be fully himself. The farm gave him back the interior silence that the city perpetually stole. Marcus Tullius Cicero, whose relationship with his country properties was shaped as much by political necessity as by acoustic preference. His estates at Tusculum, Formia, Cumae, and elsewhere were refuges not only from noise but from the dangerous currents of late Republican politics nonetheless wrote about the quality of quiet at these places with an eloquence that goes beyond mere political relief into something more fundamental. In his letters to his friend Atticus, written from various country retreats at various points in his career, the acoustic dimension of escape from Rome is palpable even when it is not explicitly named. The letters from the country have a different rhythm from those written in Rome, more expansive, more reflective, longer in their sentences and their thoughts, as though the removal of urban noise has allowed both the mind and the prose to breathe more freely. The Roman villa was never available to more than a tiny fraction of the city's population. The dream of Otium, of the quiet country retreat, was a dream only the wealthy could live. For the vast majority of Rome's inhabitants, the freedmen and slaves, the small shopkeepers and craftspeople, the seasonal workers, and the urban poor who made up the great human mass of the city, there was no Laurentine villa, no Sabine farm, no Tuscan retreat. Their acoustic refuge, to the extent that they had any, was the limited quiet of an interior room, the relative stillness of a courtyard in the early morning before the city fully woke, the few minutes of genuine silence that might occasionally, on a good night, precede the next wave of wagon traffic. This disparity is one of the most enduring and painful aspects of Rome's relationship with noise. The city's noise was a democratic affliction. It fell on everyone. but the escape from it was profoundly aristocratic, available only to those with the money to purchase distance, to build thick walls, to maintain a country estate staffed by slaves who ensured that the inconveniences of rural life did not intrude too heavily on the pleasures of rural quiet. The Roman dream of otium was real and deeply felt across the social spectrum. Even the poorest Roman, we may assume, longed for quiet, but it was realized, in its fullest form, only at the top. The villas of the Roman world have not all vanished. The remains of Pliny's Laurentine villa have been partially identified near Laurentum, though what survives is fragmentary. Hadrian's extraordinary villa, Adriana, at Tivoli, the largest and most complex villa complex to survive from antiquity, gives to us a vivid sense of the acoustic ambitions of the very greatest Roman retreats. Its carefully designed garden spaces, its multiple libraries and study rooms, its reflecting pools and fountains, all speak to a man who was, among many other things, designing his own acoustic world with the resources of an empire at his disposal. The emperors, it turned out, needed quiet as much as anyone else, perhaps more. Chapter 10. Religion, Ritual, and Sacred. Quiet in the beginning. The Romans believed, the gods listened, not passively, not indifferently, but with the focused attention of beings who cared about the precise and correct conduct of the rituals through which human beings addressed them. And if the gods listened carefully, then the humans who wished to address them successfully had better speak carefully, clearly, correctly, and without the interference of competing sounds that might carry the wrong words to divine ears, or obscure the right ones. This belief, and it was a genuine, practically operative belief in the Roman religious system, not a metaphor or a theological abstraction, had profound implications for the acoustic life of the city. Roman religion required silence, not the silence of the Christian liturgical tradition, which is partly about reverence and partly about the focused reception of divine teaching, but a more specific, more technical silence, the silence that ensures the correct performance of sacred acts, in which every word, every gesture, every sound has meaning, and the introduction of incorrect or unwanted sound could compromise the entire ritual and require it to be started again. The technical Latin term for this ritual silence was favit linguis literally. Be favorable with your tongues, usually translated as keep silent or observe silence. It was the formulaic command issued at the beginning of Roman religious ceremonies, calling on all present participants and spectators alike to cease speaking and maintain the quiet necessary for the correct performance of the rite. The formula appears repeatedly in Latin literature, used both in its original religious context and as a more general command for silence. But its religious origins tell us something important. In the Roman mind, the relationship between silence and the sacred was not incidental but foundational. The implications of faviet linguis for urban noise management were real and regularly operative. When a religious procession moved through the streets of Rome, and processions were frequent events in the Roman religious calendar, which was extraordinarily full of festivals, commemorations, and sacred occasions, the requirement of silence moved with it. The crowds that lined the streets to watch were expected to maintain quiet during the procession itself. Commercial activity in the immediate vicinity was expected to pause. The noise of workshops and markets was supposed to stop, at least temporarily, as the sacred passed by. How completely this silence was achieved in the chaotic reality of Rome's streets is, of course, another question. Roman satirists suggest, gently but persistently, that the gap between the ideal of sacred silence and the actual acoustic reality of a religious procession in a crowded city could be considerable. The city did not easily quiet itself, but the attempt was made, the expectation existed, and the social pressure to conform to it was real enough that it constituted a genuine, recurring moment of enforced acoustic restraint in the city's life. The temples themselves, the physical spaces of Roman religious activity, were designed, at least in part, with acoustic considerations in mind. The great temples of the Roman Forum, the Temple of Saturn, the Temple of Vesta, the Temple of Castor, and Pollux, were not primarily acoustic instruments in the way that a concert hall or a church designed for congregational singing might be, but their physical form, the deep porch, the solid cellar walls, the relative remove from the immediate street level achieved by the raised podium characteristic of Roman temple design, provided a degree of acoustic separation from the noise of the surrounding public spaces. The Temple of Vesta occupied a particularly important position in Rome's acoustic geography. The Vestal Virgins, the 6 priestesses who maintained the sacred hearth of Rome and performed the rituals on which, in the Roman understanding, the very safety and perpetuity of the city depended, required conditions of particular ritual purity for the conduct of their duties and the acoustic environment of the atrium vesta. Their residential and working complex adjacent to the temple was carefully managed to support those requirements. The atrium vesta was an enclosed compound whose walls separated it from the noise of the surrounding forum. Within its walls, the life of the Vestals was conducted with a formality and regularity that was, by the standards of Rome, extraordinarily quiet. The augurs, the priests, whose role was to divine the will of the gods through the observation of birds and other natural phenomena, had perhaps the most directly acoustic relationship to silence of any Roman religious practitioners. The taking of auspices, the formal observation of bird signs that was required before major public acts, from the beginning of a military campaign to the inauguration of a magistrate, demanded absolute quiet during the observation period, because the augur needed to hear, as well as see, the signs that the gods were providing. The crackling of thunder, the call of birds, the direction from which sounds came, all of these were part of the augural reading of divine intention, and all of them required an acoustic environment clean enough of human noise to be interpretable. The practical management of noise during augural observations was achieved partly through the physical setting. Observations were typically made from elevated positions outside the main urban mass, where urban noise was naturally attenuated, and partly through the legal and religious authority of the augur to command silence during the observation period. Disrupting an augural observation through noise was not merely rude, it was a religious offense, a form of the broader category of sacrilege that Roman law took seriously and Roman society treated with genuine alarm. Beyond the specific practices of augury and the broader requirements of ritual silence, Roman religion generated quiet in the city through the observance of dies, religiosi days that were considered inauspicious for normal activity, and on which certain categories of work and commerce were restricted. These restrictions were not uniform and not always strictly observed, but they represent another dimension of the way in which Roman religious life periodically imposed acoustic restraint on the city's otherwise incessant activity. The philosophical dimensions of sacred quiet in Rome extended beyond the specifically religious into the broader cultural understanding of what silence meant and what it was for. The Roman Stoics, as we have seen in Seneca's case, understood silence as a prerequisite for philosophical contemplation, and philosophical contemplation was, in the Stoic view, the closest the human mind could come to participating in the divine reason that governed the universe. This gave silence a quasi-sacred status in Stoic philosophy that paralleled, at a philosophical rather than a ritual level, the religious understanding of silence as the condition for communication with the divine. The Epicureans, the other great philosophical school whose influence on Roman intellectual life competed with Stoicism, had an even more direct relationship to acoustic quiet in their philosophical practice. The Epicurean communities established by their founder Epicurus were famously withdrawn from public life, conducted in gardens rather than in the agora or the forum, and characterized by a deliberate minimization of the kind of public, commercial, and political noise that was inherent to ordinary city life. The Epicurean ideal of ataraxia, tranquility, freedom from disturbance, had an acoustic dimension that was not merely metaphorical. Epicurean philosophical life was, in its physical practice, quieter than the life of the public square. In the later imperial period, as Rome's population began to include growing numbers of Christians and, later, to include Christians in positions of imperial authority, a new understanding of sacred silence entered the city's religious life. Christian liturgical practice, drawing on Jewish synagogue traditions and developing its own distinctive forms, placed great emphasis on the attentive silence of the congregation during scripture reading, preaching, and prayer. The early churches built in Rome, the Tituli, the house churches that preceded the great basilicas of the Constantinian period, were spaces in which a different kind of acoustic reverence was cultivated, one that would eventually transform the acoustic expectations of European religious life in ways that are still felt today. The great basilicas built after Constantine's Edict of Milan in 313 AD, the Basilica of St. John Lateran, Old St. Peter's, Santa Maria Maggiore, brought new architectural forms into Rome's religious landscape, and with them new acoustic environments. The long nave of the Christian basilica, with its parallel arcades and apse, created a very different acoustic experience from the small, enclosed cellar of a Roman temple, more reverberant, more enveloping, better suited to congregational singing and to the kind of acoustic immersion that Christian liturgy increasingly embraced. The story of sacred silence in Rome is therefore not a single story but a conversation between multiple religious and philosophical traditions, each bringing its own understanding of what silence was for and why it mattered, each influencing in its own way the acoustic expectations of the city and its inhabitants. What they shared, the traditional Roman religion, the philosophical schools, and eventually Christianity, was the conviction that silence was not merely the absence of noise, but the presence of something important, the divine, the rational, the sacred, the true. And this conviction, embedded in Rome's religious and philosophical culture across many centuries, was itself a form of noise management, a cultural insistence that quiet mattered, that it served purposes beyond mere personal comfort, that it was worth protecting and pursuing even in the most relentlessly noisy city the ancient world had produced. Chapter 11. The gradual collapse, noise in the declining empire. Silence, when it finally came to Rome, did not announce itself. It crept in through the back alleys and the half-empty insulae, moving into the spaces left by those who had gone to the countryside, to the provinces, to plague-thinned graves, to the grinding diminishment of a civilization losing its momentum as water loses pressure when the pipe begins to crack. The silence of Rome's decline was not the silence that Pliny the Younger had found in his Laurentine villa, or that Horace had celebrated on his Sabine farm. It was not chosen, not designed, not the fruit of wealth and philosophical intention. It was the silence of loss, and it arrived slowly, over centuries, and those who lived through it may not have recognized it for what it was. To understand what the declining empire meant for Roman noise, and why the story of noise management in Rome ends not in triumph, but in something more complicated and more poignant, we need to understand the nature of the decline itself. The Western Roman Empire did not fall suddenly, as the popular image of barbarians at the gate might suggest. It declined over a period of roughly 2.5 centuries, from the crisis of the 3rd century AD, when a catastrophic combination of military pressure, political instability, economic disruption, and epidemic disease nearly destroyed the empire, through to the conventional end date of 476 AD, when the last Western emperor, the young Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by the Ostrogothic chieftain Odoacer. Throughout this long decline, the city of Rome itself experienced a demographic transformation of extraordinary magnitude. At its peak under the early empire, Rome had housed perhaps 1 million people. By the early 5th century AD, the city's population had fallen dramatically. Estimates vary, but a population of between 500,000 and 800,000 by the time of the Visigothic sack of 410 AD seems plausible. By the mid-6th century, after the devastation of the Gothic Wars between the Eastern Roman Empire and the Ostrogothic Kingdom, Rome's population may have fallen as low as 50,000, a loss of 95% or more of its peak population over the course of roughly 4 centuries. This demographic collapse had obvious and immediate implications for the acoustic character of the city. A city of 50,000 is not merely a smaller version of a city of 1 million. It is a qualitatively different acoustic environment. The commercial activity that generated so much of Rome's noise, the markets, the workshops, the delivery wagons, the vendor calls, the din of 1 million people conducting their daily business, contracted as the population contracted. Streets that had been barely wide enough for the press of daily commercial traffic now saw that traffic thin and slow. Workshops that had hammered and fired through the night grew quieter as demand fell and skilled workers left for safer provinces. The insulae emptied floor by floor, and the sounds of multiple overlapping domestic lives that had filled them gave way to the sounds of wind through cracked walls and birds nesting in abandoned upper stories. The Antonine Plague of 165 to 180 AD, a devastating epidemic, possibly smallpox, that swept the empire during the reign of Marcus Aurelius and may have killed 5 million people or more, was the first major demographic shock to hit Rome's population in the imperial period. The city's mortality during the plague years was severe, and the acoustic effects were immediate and noticeable. Contemporaries recorded the strange quiet that settled over usually noisy neighborhoods when disease had thinned their populations to a fraction of normal. Marcus Aurelius himself, writing his meditations during the plague years on campaign against the Marcomanni on the Danube frontier, does not directly address the acoustic effects of depopulation in Rome. but his meditations have, even for a Stoic text, a quality of unusual quiet, a philosophical intensity that feels in retrospect like the product of a mind that had experienced loss on a scale that altered the entire acoustic and social landscape of its world. The plague of Cyprian, which ravaged the empire from approximately 249 to 262 AD, was by many accounts even more severe than the Antonine plague. The Bishop Pontius of Carthage, writing a hagiographic account of the plague years, described streets emptied of their usual commercial activity, a silence falling over city centers as the dead accumulated faster than they could be removed. This is hagiographic literature and must be read with appropriate caution, but the basic pattern it describes, commercial activity contracting, population thinning, the noise of urban life diminishing as its generators died or fled, is supported by archaeological and demographic evidence from across the empire. The political instability of the 3rd century, the period known to historians as the crisis of the 3rd century, during which the empire had over 70 emperors in 50 years, most of them assassinated. As the military and the Senate competed for control of an increasingly fragile state, had indirect but real effects on the noise of Rome. Political instability meant economic disruption, which meant disrupted trade networks, which meant reduced commercial activity, which meant less of the commercial noise that had been so central to Rome's acoustic character. The great market complexes of the city did not empty overnight, but they contracted, and their contraction was audible. The fiscal pressures of maintaining military defense on multiple endangered frontiers led to debasement of the currency, which caused inflation, which disrupted commercial activity further, which reduced the population's purchasing power, and therefore the scale and intensity of the market activity that had been such a defining feature of Roman acoustic life. The merchants who had filled the Mercati di Traiano with their vendor calls, who had crowded the Messella with their commercial energy, faced economic conditions that made their businesses increasingly difficult to sustain, and some portion of them simply stopped, left the city, changed trades, or reduced their activities to a scale that was acoustically much less imposing. The great public baths, those extraordinary thermae that had been such central institutions of Roman social and acoustic life, began to deteriorate in the 3rd and 4th centuries as the economic and political conditions required to maintain them became increasingly difficult to sustain. The imperial baths required enormous resources, continuous supplies of wood to heat the hypocausts, the underfloor heating systems, constant maintenance of the aqueducts that supplied their water, large staffs of slaves and freedmen to operate them, regular restoration of the decorative programs that announced their grandeur. As state revenues contracted and political attention focused increasingly on military survival, the maintenance of bath complexes became harder to sustain. Some closed, others continued in degraded form, their grand vaulted halls partially abandoned, their acoustic character changed by the reduction in the number of users who once filled them with the sound of Roman social life at its most communal. The sacks of Rome by the Visigoths in 410 AD and by the Vandals in 455 AD were catastrophic events that accelerated the demographic collapse of the city and produced immediate, dramatic acoustic effects. Contemporary accounts of the aftermath of the Visigothic sack describe a city of extraordinary silence, streets empty of their normal commerce, the forum quiet in ways it had not been for centuries, neighborhoods that had once been among the noisiest in the world, reduced to the sound of wind and lamentation. Jerome, writing from Bethlehem, was so horrified by reports of Rome's sacking that he could barely form words. The city that had seemed eternal, that had generated its noise for centuries as though it would do so forever, had been violated into a silence that felt, to those who heard of it across the empire, like the silence of death. Salvian of Marseille, writing in the 5th century AD in his work De Gubernation Dei, on the governance of God, described the condition of Roman cities in his own time with the eye of a man watching a living thing slowly die. The noise of commercial life had diminished. The public spaces that had once been full were now partially empty. The sounds of civic life, the courts, the markets, the baths, the political assemblies, had contracted toward silence as the institutions that generated them weakened and in some cases ceased to function. What makes this story particularly affecting, in the context of everything we have examined in the preceding chapters, is the profound irony at its heart. The Romans had spent centuries trying to manage their noise, legislating it, architecturally buffering it, philosophically enduring it, escaping it to country villas, regulating it through law, insisting that the gods required its periodic suspension. The noise of Rome had been, for all its misery, the sound of the city's life, of 1 million people conducting their commerce, their worship, their politics, their social rituals, their daily survival in proximity to one another. The silence that eventually came was not the silence of philosophy or of acoustic engineering or of wise legislation. It was the silence of depopulation, of economic collapse, of civilization losing its structural integrity under pressures that no law and no architecture could address. Juvenal had said, "Leave the city if you cannot bear the noise. Go to the provinces, where you might actually sleep." By the 5th century, many Romans had done exactly that, not out of philosophical choice, but out of necessity. And the city they left behind grew quieter with each departure, until the quiet itself became a kind of evidence of all that had been lost. Chapter 12. The echo that reaches us. Rome's noise legacy in the modern world. Stand in the Roman Forum on a quiet morning in early spring, before the tourists arrive, before the city fully wakes. The light comes in low and golden over the Palatine Hill, picking out the broken columns and the ancient stones with the particular clarity that early light gives to old things. And in the stillness, the relative stillness, because Rome is never truly silent, you can almost hear it. Not the noise itself, which is gone, which has been gone for 15 centuries, but the shape of the noise, the acoustic ghost of 1 million people going about their lives in this place, in these streets, under this sky. This is fanciful, of course. You cannot hear the past, but you can know it, and knowing it changes the way you hear the present. And the present, the noise of our own cities, our own streets, our own crowded lives, is in ways both direct and indirect, shaped by what Rome experienced, thought, wrote, built, legislated, and endured across 1,000 years of acoustic struggle. The most direct line of transmission from Roman noise management to the modern world runs through law. Roman law, as we have examined, developed a sophisticated framework for thinking about noise as a legal problem. The concept of immixio, the doctrine of reasonable use, the distinction between ordinary and excessive noise, the role of public authority in regulating commercial acoustic intrusion. This framework did not die with the Western Empire. It was preserved in the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, where Justinian's 6th century compilation of Roman legal learning kept it alive and systematically organized. It entered medieval European legal tradition through the rediscovery of Roman law in the 11th and 12th centuries, particularly through the Great Law School at Bologna, where generations of legal scholars studied the digest of Justinian and drew from it the principles that would shape the legal systems of France, Italy, Spain, Germany, and their colonial descendants. The nuisance doctrine of English common law, the body of law that governs a neighbor's right to complain about another neighbor's noise, and which forms the basis of noise-related tort law throughout the English-speaking world, has its deepest roots in Roman legal principles, even though it developed in a tradition that was not formally Roman law. The concepts of reasonableness, of the ordinary expectations of a reasonable person, of the balancing of competing property rights, these are Roman legal concepts, translated into a different legal vocabulary, but operating on the same fundamental, logical structure. The traffic regulations of medieval European cities show the influence of Caesarian precedent with remarkable clarity. Many of the cities of medieval Italy, Rome itself, Florence, Venice, Milan, Bologna, maintained restrictions on wheeled traffic in urban areas that were explicitly modeled on, or directly descended from, the Roman framework. The nighttime curfews on heavy vehicles that appear in medieval municipal statutes are, in their essential structure, recognizable echoes of Caesar's 44 BC ordinance. The Romans had established the conceptual framework that a city government had the legitimate authority to restrict private commercial activity in the public interest, specifically in the interest of the acoustic quality of urban life, and that framework proved durable enough to outlast the civilization that created it. The Theodosian Code, the compilation of imperial legislation assembled in 438 AD under the Emperor Theodosius II, covering the century from Constantine to Theodosius, transmitted many of the noise-relevant provisions of earlier Roman law into the legal frameworks of the successor states that emerged from the Western Empire's dissolution. The Visigothic law, the Burgundian law, the Frankish Salic law, all drew on Roman legal materials to varying degrees, and all preserved, in adapted forms, some of the Roman legal thinking about noise and public order. The urban planning traditions of Rome, the use of interior courtyards, the orientation of buildings away from noise sources, the strategic placement of water features, The design of elite residences around progressive acoustic insulation became embedded in the architectural traditions of the Mediterranean world in ways that persisted through the Byzantine and Islamic periods and re-entered European practice during the Renaissance. The courtyard house, the palazzo, organized around an interior cortile, which became the dominant form of elite urban architecture in Renaissance Italy, is in direct descent from the Roman domus organized around its peristyle garden, and the acoustic logic is the same. Put the noise of the street as far as possible from the private spaces of the house by interposing mass, distance, and the sound of water. The philosophical legacy of Rome's noise experience is perhaps less directly traceable, but no less real. The body of Roman writing about noise, Seneca's letters, Juvenal's satires, Martial's epigrams, Pliny's villa descriptions, was part of the educational canon of humanistic learning in Renaissance and early modern Europe. Read by educated people across the continent in the original Latin and in vernacular translations. The attitudes toward urban noise that this literature expressed and shaped, the sense that noise was a genuine impediment to intellectual and moral life, that the pursuit of quiet was a legitimate and important human aspiration, that the city owed its inhabitants some degree of acoustic consideration percolated through European intellectual culture in ways that are difficult to measure precisely but impossible to ignore. Petrarch, widely regarded as the first great humanist and one of the founding figures of the intellectual tradition that led to the Renaissance, was a passionate reader of Cicero and Seneca, and his writings about the need for solitude and quiet for intellectual work draw explicitly on the Roman tradition of ostium. His account of climbing Mont Ventoux in 1336, often cited as a key moment in the development of Renaissance individualism, is essentially a romantic extension of the Roman villa tradition, the withdrawal from the noise of the world in search of the quiet necessary for self-knowledge. The Roman shape of this aspiration is clearly visible through the medieval and Renaissance surface. Francis Petrarch's successors in the humanist tradition, Erasmus, Thomas More, Michel de Montaigne, all lived in urban environments considerably quieter than Rome at its peak, but all expressed, in terms clearly descended from the Roman tradition, the need for retreat, for quiet study, for the acoustic conditions that serious intellectual work requires. Montaigne's famous tower library at the Château de Montaigne, where he wrote his essays, deliberately set apart from the main house, positioned to minimize domestic noise. A private acoustic sanctuary in the Roman villa tradition is a direct descendant of Pliny the Younger's Dieta at the end of the Hippodrome Garden. The Industrial Revolution created noise conditions in European and American cities that, for the first time since Rome, rivaled and eventually exceeded the acoustic intensity of the ancient metropolis. The noise of steam engines, of factory machinery, of railway trains, of horse-drawn traffic on cobblestone streets, all of these produced a new urban acoustic crisis that generated, predictably, a new wave of noise complaint, noise literature, and eventually noise legislation. The vocabulary of this modern noise discourse, the appeal to health, to the right of quiet enjoyment, to the public interest in acoustic quality, is different in its scientific framing from the Roman vocabulary, but the underlying moral and civic logic is strikingly continuous. The first modern noise ordinances, the municipal noise regulations that began appearing in European and American cities in the 19th and early 20th centuries, drew on legal traditions rooted in Roman law. The nuisance doctrine, the principle of reasonable use, the balancing of commercial and residential interests, all of these Roman legal concepts provided the framework within which modern noise regulation developed. When the New York City Health Department issued its first noise code in 1936, or when the United Kingdom passed its Noise Abatement Act in 1960, or when the World Health Organization published its guidelines on community noise in 1999, all of these were building, consciously or not, on foundations that Roman jurists had laid to millennia earlier. The modern science of acoustics, the physics of sound, the psychology of noise, the technology of noise measurement and control has given us tools that the Romans could not have imagined. We can measure sound in decibels, map noise pollution across an entire city using computer modeling, design buildings with acoustic performance specifications that would have seemed miraculous to a Roman architect. We have noise-canceling technology, acoustic insulation materials, urban planning regulations, environmental impact assessments for noise. We have, in other words, a vastly more sophisticated toolkit for noise management than ancient Rome possessed. And yet, 2,000 years after Julius Caesar banned wheeled traffic from Rome's daytime streets, we are still arguing about urban noise in terms that Caesar and Seneca and Juvenal would recognize immediately. We are still debating the line between the legitimate noise of productive economic activity and the excessive noise that constitutes an imposition on neighbors. We are still struggling with the acoustic implications of dense urban living, with the unequal distribution of noise burden across social classes, with the difficulty of enforcing noise regulations in a world that runs on commerce and competition, and the constant press of human activity. We are still, in short, Roman. The Romans did not solve noise pollution. This is a fact worth stating clearly, without the softening that sometimes creeps into historical accounts that wish to celebrate the past. Rome's noise was real, persistent, and genuinely harmful to the quality of life of millions of people who had no effective remedy against it. Its legislation was imperfectly enforced. Its architectural solutions were available only to the wealthy. Its philosophical frameworks for endurance were, by definition, strategies of adaptation rather than genuine solutions. The city never slept, and those who needed sleep went to their graves the worse for it. But what Rome did, and this is the legacy that endures, was to insist that noise was a problem worth taking seriously, to write about it with intelligence and passion, to legislate about it with genuine civic ambition, to build against it with architectural sophistication, to retreat from it with deliberate philosophical intention, to argue, in courts and in literature and in philosophy and in medicine, that human beings had a legitimate claim to some degree of acoustic quality in their lives, that the city owed its inhabitants not silence, which was impossible, but a reasonable effort toward the conditions under which human life could be lived with dignity and purpose, and the occasional gift of uninterrupted sleep. That argument, that noise, is a civic problem, not merely a personal misfortune. That managing it is a legitimate function of law and architecture and urban governance. That the quality of the acoustic environment matters to the quality of human life is Rome's greatest and most underappreciated contribution to the history of the city. It is an argument that has been made in every century since, in every language that inherits the Western tradition, in every court that adjudicates a noise nuisance claim, in every city council that debates a noise ordinance, in every architect who designs a building with acoustic performance in mind. The city of Rome eventually fell quiet. Its streets, which had thundered with the passage of 1,000,000 lives, fell silent. Its markets emptied. Its baths cooled. Its great buildings stood in lengthening silence as the centuries accumulated and the population drained away and the noise of the ancient world faded into the long quiet of the early medieval period. But the echo did not die. It traveled through law and architecture and literature and philosophy, through the slow transmission of ideas across time and space that is the deepest form of human continuity. It arrived in our own cities, our own courts, our own building codes, our own environmental regulations, our own restless arguments about the noise of the world we have made and the quiet we have not yet managed to achieve. We are, still, in the middle of the conversation that Rome began, and the city, as it has always been, is still very loud. Good night, traveler. Sleep well. Until we meet again.